We still don't know where COVID-19 came from. I mean, we know it came from bats, but whether it proceeded from there direct to human beings or via a third animal or via a Wuhan laboratory, that remains unknown. But what has become more and more clearly revealed is that various agencies were working on projects and in a way that made the risk of such an outcome higher. And after the event, there was an active attempt to cover up and control the narrative. Let's have a look. I first looked at the lab leak hypothesis for the origin of COVID in February last year, when even just talking about it could get you ridiculed as a conspiracist. And that wasn't entirely surprising. In the early days, most of the stuff being put forward on that proposition was pretty wild and relatively quickly debunked. But eventually, some signal began to emerge from the noise, and you had to say to yourself, wait a minute, there's no proof here. But remind me why this is being dismissed out of hand again, because that doesn't seem right. I've since done several update videos on the topic. I will link to all of them in the video description below. But over time, there have been more claims and counterclaims, and while scientific evidence has been thin on the ground, evidence of the actions of people and institutions has been gradually coming out into full view. And there have been a few examples of actual investigative journalism. And I was prompted to do this video because Vanity Fair produced a second major investigative piece on the topic, which I think was really quite enlightening. They'd gotten hold of, amongst other things, a huge tranche of emails and documents from one of the organisations most directly implicated, EcoHealth Alliance. And it paints a much more vivid picture of what was happening behind the scenes. Sufficiently so, I thought it was worth taking a fresh look at it. Let's just do the quick recap for those that haven't been following this. The Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has the highest biosecurity level 4 laboratories for handling highly dangerous pathogens, carried out research on coronaviruses from bats, supported by US funding via an organisation called EcoHealth Alliance, whose president, Peter Daszak, was a lead figure in promoting the research. There have been big questions about whether the lab was involved in gain-of-function research, which involves taking a virus and either through genetic manipulation or by a speeded-up evolutionary passage within a third-party animal, gives it features that it didn't otherwise have. Principle being that you can make a pathogen more dangerous, which might then, of course, accidentally escape into the wild. It's a process that has supporters saying that it provides useful information to help anticipate and avoid future pandemics. It also has critics who will argue that you may inadvertently end up by creating the thing you seek to avoid. And that's the question. Various people have studied the genetic makeup of SARS-CoV-2, and although some have claimed that it definitively shows that it must have been genetically manipulated, and others have argued that on the contrary, it shows that it definitely has not been genetically manipulated, as far as I've been able to ascertain, nothing in the genetics alone rules out a lab leak, or rules it in. The laboratory could have been dealing with an entirely natural virus that was brought from a bat cave to a human city, or it could have been one that was accelerated in its evolution artificially, and you end up arguing about more and more technical details. The problem is that both sides are now vociferously arguing for a side, and those are voices that I don't tend to trust on technical information that we have no hope of understanding. Partisans are not reliable narrators. Let's talk about how we got here. EcoHealth Alliance started as a small organisation originally named Wildlife Trust, focused on conservation, but had gradually pivoted over the years, and Peter Daszak had introduced a strong focus on potential pathogens in bats and pandemic prevention. In 2001, in the wake of anthrax being mailed to certain figures, and also the first SARS outbreak in China in 2002, money began pouring into research to defend against bioterrorism. The Vanity Fair piece talks about how actively the group courted the grant makers, holding special so-called cultivation events at the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., receptions with plenty of brie and Chardonnay to attract potential funders. Anthony Fauci was the scientific kingmaker though, and Peter Daszak set about assiduously courting him. Particularly, he wanted to share a podium with him. Now bear in mind at this point, Daszak and EcoHealth Alliance were tiny and obscure, just one amongst many looking for the big break, trying to get attention. Daszak obviously has good skills as a networker. He successfully cultivated back-channel access to the people who managed Fauci's diary. Now, even that wasn't enough at first. All invitations to Fauci got rejected. But in 2016, Fauci's senior advisor, David Morans, gave Daszak a tip, saying that Fauci normally says no to almost everything like this, unless ABC, NBC, CBS and Fox are all there with cameras running. If he were asked to give the main talk, or the only talk, that might increase the chances. Daszak modified the invitation accordingly, and Fauci duly signed up to give a presentation on the Zika virus at the Cosmos Club. That event attracted a lot of the government department types that were the potential funders for Daszak. How had Daszak even been in a position, as the head of a small non-profit that didn't have a laboratory, to get that sort of opportunity? Well, he had cultivated an affiliation with Shi Zhengli, the Chinese scientist, also known as the Batwoman, who was to go on to become the director of the Wuhan Institute's Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases. In 2005, Daszak and Shi co-authored a first paper together, having carried out field research in 4 locations, looking at horseshoe bats, identifying them as a likely source for SARS-like coronaviruses. They collaborated on a further 17 papers. In 2013, they reported that they discovered a SARS-like bat coronavirus which might be able to infect human cells without first jumping to an intermediate animal. Bear in mind, so far, so positive. This was useful and, as we now know, entirely appropriate work. There's no reason to think anything but that these people were doing work of high societal value, who were committed to the positive outcomes of that work and who were appropriately funded to do so. And the funding had certainly come in. In 2009, USAID awarded $75 million in a grant called PREDICT. Daszak's organisation was one of 4 that received it. In an internal email, Daszak told his staff that the $18 million grant over 5 years awarded to them was a game changer. At a stroke, it increased the organisation's budget by half, moved it from operating loss to surplus for the first time in years, and enabled it to grow. After the initial term, EcoHealth Alliance had its PREDICT grant renewed for another 5 years. And at the same time, the NIH approved another grant, this one for $3.7 million, called Understanding the Risk of Bat Coronavirus Emergence. One of the former EcoHealth staffers, who was interviewed for the Vanity Fair article, recalled working closely with Shi Zhengli on a part of the project to screen the blood of villagers close to bat caves for coronavirus antibodies. And she said this: "I never got a result from Shi via phone. I had to show up in China to learn anything from her. While she was a world-class scientist, she respects the Chinese system." Which hardly needs to be said, because a high-security virus laboratory is not a normal organisation, and government interest in such areas is going to be intense. You can't be a leader at such an institution without understanding your place in the Chinese system. I say this because a number of Western scientists went on to argue that science was all about collaboration, and any idea that the Wuhan Institute might not be transparent was totally ridiculous and political. One might hold that to reflect a degree of wishful thinking, maybe even naivety, or willful blindness maybe, as to the nature of authoritarian government. We'll come back to that. In 2016, Daszak's $3.7 million NIH grant first set off some alarm bells. The second-year annual progress report was late. Funding agencies get pretty heavy about such things. Eventually it was submitted. And when it arrived, it had started to wander somewhat from the sort of work we'd seen to date and into the highly contentious area of gain-of-function research, which had been subject to a federal moratorium since 2014. Specifically, it said that scientists planned to create an infectious clone of the MERS virus that appeared in Saudi Arabia in 2012 and killed 35% of the people that it infected. And it reported that the NIH grant had already been used to construct 2 chimeric coronaviruses, similar to the ones that caused SARS in 2002. Now, chimeric viruses are made up of 2 or more different viruses combined together. Daszak wrote to the NIH's grant specialist that the chimeras were exempt from the moratorium because the strains used hadn't previously been known to affect humans. He pointed to a 2015 research paper by Shi Zhengli and respected coronavirus researcher Ralph Barrick. The Vanity Fair article observes that this paper didn't entirely give reassurance, given that the authors went out of their way to flag the dangers of the approach. Daszak pitched to the NIH a compromise on the MERS study, arguing that if any of the recombined strains showed 10 times greater growth than a natural virus, they would immediately stop work and inform the program officer. Which was all well and good, but it was pointed out that the work was being carried out in China. So how exactly would that oversight work? On June the 27th, Daszak wrote, "We will clarify tonight with Professor Zhengli Shi exactly who will be notified if we see enhanced replication. My understanding is that I will be notified straight away as principal investigator and that I can then notify you at NIAID." Well, it's very touching that his understanding was that he would be notified straight away. I would have held that to be a pretty weak guarantee, to be honest. And indeed, an unnamed former staffer at EcoHealth Alliance told Vanity Fair that Daszak had, quote, far less visibility into the WIV than he let on. The work being done there was always an enigma. The non-profit had hired a US-based Chinese national who helped interpret for them what was happening inside the WIV, but we had to take everything at face value. It was more accept what it is because of this relationship between Shi and Daszak. He doesn't know what happened in that lab, said the former staffer. He cannot know that. But the NIH agreed, and the pause on the funding was lifted. A decision that was probably one that Fauci would come to regret, you have to imagine. However, much of this was skirting the boundaries. It wasn't the work that could have conceivably created COVID-19. In 2017, EcoHealth Alliance was facing the traditional dilemma for organisations that get the privilege of major grant funding. The prospect for that funding is going to come to an end. At that point, 9/10 of its money came from the federal government, of which over 70% was the PREDICT grant, which at that point was going to end in 2 years' time. Now, maybe there'd be another renewal, but maybe not. And you needed to be working on other potential streams. They identified one very hopeful looking one. DARPA, the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, was looking for proposals for its new PREEMPT programme, which looked to identify animal pathogens to preempt their entry into human populations before an outbreak occurs. I think we can all agree that is kind of a great idea. We wish it had been more effective more quickly. And it seemed custom made for EcoHealth Alliance by that point. Work was put into a bid to DARPA, and according to the documents Vanity Fair got hold of, it was a pretty chaotic process. Various collaborators, including Shi Zhengli in China and Ralph Barrick in North Carolina, and various others, all pitching in. Documents were being written by many people and were not being brilliantly well coordinated. Within the final proposal was the suggestion that they would collect bat samples from caves in Yunnan province, transport them to Wuhan, extract and manipulate the viruses they contained, and use them to infect mice with humanized lungs. And one detail particularly stood out with the benefit of hindsight: to examine SARS-like bat coronaviruses for furin cleavage sites, the feature that enables viruses to effectively infect human cells, and which stood out from the start as a feature with SARS-CoV-2. and then possibly to insert new ones where they weren't present. If that work was being carried out at the Wuhan Institute, you would have to rate it as a coincidence too far. I mean, wouldn't you? Look, coincidences happen all the time. It's a big world. Lots of things happen. They don't constitute proof, but it would be pretty incredible. The question is, was that work being carried out? Because DARPA took one look at his proposal and concluded, no way, Jose. A former DARPA official told Vanity Fair the contract wasn't awarded because, quote, because of the horrific lack of common sense. It was demonstrably gain-of-function research. Daszak's weak arguments that it was exempt were simply not accepted. Reportedly, DARPA viewed EcoHealth Alliance as a ragtag group and a middle guy. But also the Wuhan Institute was viewed as subpar compared with the other Chinese highest biosafety laboratory at the Harbin Veterinary Research Institute. So the project, which was an obvious roadmap to a SARS-CoV-2 virus, did not go ahead with DARPA funding. The question is whether, having focused on the bid and developed the ideas for the programme, whether the Wuhan Institute found another way to go ahead with it anyway, without Daszak and the US government funding. By late December 2019, cases of SARS-CoV-2 were beginning to emerge, roughly 8 miles from the Wuhan Institute. On January the 30th, Peter Daszak went on to the US arm of Chinese state television and praised the Chinese government, which he said was being open and transparent, which would work with the WHO, would talk to scientists around the world and bring them in to help. Yeah, that didn't happen. In fact, as the virus spread, China began clamping down on anyone who spoke out about it. It ordered samples to be destroyed, it punished doctors who raised the alarm, and put in tight restrictions where it would review any scientific research about COVID-19 before publication. In those early days, some people were feeling somewhat alarmed at how things were going, and more particularly, it seems, who might get blamed for it. In mid-January, the director of the CDC, Robert Redfield, had phone conversations with 3 scientific leaders, Fauci, Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust and Tedros Ghebreyesus at the WHO, arguing that the lab leak hypothesis had to be taken seriously. We've seen separately the release, albeit heavily redacted, of the emails of some of the conversation that was happening at the time. Initially, scientists thought it looked obviously manipulated, this virus. But then there was a conference call of carefully selected scientists, and after that the message instantly changed. A paper on the proximal origin of COVID-19 was being worked on, which counted out the idea of a lab origin. And while that was happening, Peter Daszak was organising a letter to be published by The Lancet, which stated this: "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." It was only uncovered 9 months later by a Freedom of Information request that Daszak was the coordinator of that letter, which was published by The Lancet, by the way, with a statement that none of the signatories had a conflict of interest. Well, it's hard to imagine a more grievous conflict of interest than that held by Peter Daszak at that time. And let's be clear, the clear and present danger for virus researchers in general, and Daszak in particular, was that scientists would be blamed for COVID-19, whether rightly or wrongly, and that could devastate the work that they believed in and which provided their livelihoods. And Daszak was right to see that coming. On April the 17th, a reporter for Newsmax asked President Trump why the NIH would fund a $3.7 million grant to a lab in China, and Trump replied off the cuff, "We will end that grant very quickly." 6 days later, Daszak got a letter from the NIH terminating the grant and beginning a battle over whether the terms of the grant had been complied with. One of the key questions was around the fact that the Wuhan Institute had taken down its online database of 22,000 genomic sequences in September 2019, soon before the onset of the pandemic. A number of the samples contained within it were the ones that had been funded by US tax money, and they had now been made inaccessible exactly when they were needed to fulfill the original intended purpose. Peter Daszak warned other partners on the PREDICT program not to publicly release certain sequences. And he wrote this: "It's extremely important that we don't have these sequences as part of our PREDICT release to GenBank at this point. As you may have heard, these were part of a grant just terminated by NIH. Having them as part of PREDICT will bring very unwelcome attention to the PREDICT program, grant partners and USAID." The following year, an evolutionary biologist, Jesse Bloom, sent a draft of a paper he'd written to Fauci, highlighting how a number of the early SARS-CoV-2 genomic sequences mentioned in a published paper from China had also vanished without trace. He suspected that their disappearance showed the Chinese government might be trying to hide evidence about the early pandemic. In looking into the question, he'd uncovered that the NIH itself had deleted the sequences from its own archive, clearly at the request of the researchers in Wuhan. He was hoping that Fauci and the NIH director Francis Collins could help him to identify other deleted sequences that might cast a light on the mystery. A Zoom meeting was immediately organised, and Francis Collins brought along a couple of scientists that had been involved in that early meeting and the Proximal Origins paper, namely Christian Anderson and Robert Gary. Bloom invited two of his colleagues. Sometime after the meeting, Bloom wrote down a note of it, which was obtained by Vanity Fair. After he'd described his research at the meeting, things went south rather quickly. Christian Anderson reportedly leapt in, saying that the paper was deeply troubling and saying that if Chinese scientists wanted to delete their sequences from the database, which NIH policy allowed, it was unethical for Bloom to analyse them further. Which is not a conventional approach to, potential evidence at a crime scene. Soon things all got rather shouty. And bear in mind, by this time the NIH team had been getting rather a lot of heat, and I have a lot of sympathy for this, and this was brought into the equation. Anderson came up with this objection, according to Bloom's notes, saying that recent publicity meant that he, quote, needed security outside his house, and my preprint would fuel conspiratorial notions that China was hiding data and thereby lead to more criticism of scientists such as himself. Now, I'm sympathetic about the heat, but then if that's accurately reported, and I say if, it's hearsay at the end of the day, it would be rather telling. The idea that American scientists might want to argue that China was not hiding data, that Chinese government was not hiding data in spite of its behaviour, overwhelmingly to the contrary, because if they did, it might reflect on them. The note then says that Anderson suggested that he was a screener of a preprint server where Bloom had registered his paper, and if Bloom had wished, he could entirely delete the preprint or revise it in a way that would leave no record this had been done, an offer which was refused. It's worth noting that in Twitter exchanges since the Vanity Fair article went live, Christian Anderson has vigorously attacked this claim, even as far as calling it an outright lie. He said he offered his help if Bloom had wanted to revise his preprint in the light of the criticisms, and noted that since he didn't, the preprint duly went live 2 days later. And he added his view that Bloom's accusations were unscientific, claiming cover-ups and corruption by Chinese scientists. I find such unsupported accusations deeply inappropriate, but that's me. Mind you, the NIH was keen to get the data that it felt it should have. By October 2021, it had repeatedly demanded that EcoHealth Alliance turn over data relating to its grant research with the WIV. Daszak argued that he couldn't share a number of SARS coronavirus sequences because he was waiting for the Chinese government to authorise their release. Which seems like an excellent return on investment for all that American grant funding. That brings us then to one other eye-popping aspect of this latest article. You probably recall that jaws had already hit the ground when the WHO revealed that the investigation team that it was sending into the origins of COVID-19, the sole US representative, was Peter Daszak. That mission was generally dismissed as something of a fiasco. They made one trip to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They asked the people there if they'd found anything untoward. They said no, and that was pretty much it. They came back with a report that suggested that transmission through frozen food, the Chinese authorities' explanation of preference at the time, supported by zero evidence whatsoever, of course, that was possible. But transmission through a laboratory accident was, quote, extremely unlikely. The WHO Director General felt moved to effectively disown it on the day that it was released, and it was killed 3 months later when the lead expert, Peter Mbarek, admitted that the group had made a deal with the Chinese experts. They could mention the lab leak theory only if they didn't recommend any further studies into the hypothesis, so that's what they did. You might think that is a pathetic charade. I can't say that is an unreasonable conclusion. But that we all knew. The revelation comes in a letter to the NIH's Deputy Director. Daszak more or less admitted that he'd followed his own personal interest in being on that WHO group. So in April 2021, he wrote this, arguing for the NIH to restore EcoHealth's grant funding. I have made extensive efforts to satisfy NIH's broad concerns. This includes serving as an expert on the WHO-China joint mission on the animal origins of COVID-19, which involved 1 month on the ground in China, including 2 weeks locked in quarantine, at great personal burden and risk to me, to our organisation and to my family. Then Vanity Fair summarised the rest. He wrote that while he had acted in good faith to follow the WHO's directives for the mission, he had also gathered essential information that specifically addresses one of the demands the NIH had made as a condition of reinstating the grants, that he arranged for an outside inspection team to find out if the WIV had SARS-CoV-2 in its possession prior to December 2019. He'd returned with categorical statements from WIV senior staff that they did not have it prior to December 2019, he wrote, and had managed to get their assurances included in the WHO final report. Think about that. These important questions about the origins of this appalling pandemic that has devastated the world in various ways, placed in the hands of someone who went in with an agenda to prove the lack of culpability so that his grant could be reinstated. The NIH was not charmed and the grant remained suspended. None of this proves that SARS-CoV-2 came from a Wuhan lab. There are technical arguments, some put forward arguing the contrary, and they may well be right. At the same time, some of the institutions around this and the small subsection of the virology field focused on this very particular area does not emerge with a huge amount of credit for how people responded to the crisis. Covering backs and avoiding blame, it's an understandable human instinct, but the situation arguably called for something a bit better. In the meantime, we've seen other contributions. Anderson, Gary and a number of other co-authors published a preprint last month claiming dispositive evidence that SARS-CoV-2 originated from the Wuhan market. Some have dismissed it as providing supporting evidence but well short of proof. But if you're standing on the outside trying to make sense of all this, it's hard to know whose analysis to believe anymore. China's CDC alternatively published a preprint of its own that Vanity Fair interpreted as pushing the other way, saying that of the 457 swabs taken from 18 species of animals in the market, none contained evidence of the virus. It suggested that while the market served as an amplifier of the viral spread, it didn't prove that the market was the source itself. And then on March the 16th, the journal BMJ Global Health published a study by a group of Italian scientists suggesting that the virus may have been spreading worldwide for weeks or even months before the officially noted start date of December 2019. Which would change the situation significantly in ways that we can't even quite predict. So, what's the final take from all of this? Actually, first it's worth mentioning that getting all these EcoHealth emails and documents did not do one thing that it might have done. Didn't turn up a smoking gun of, oh my God, we did it type emails. From all the evidence, it seems unlikely that EcoHealth's work directly caused SARS-CoV-2. There remains the question about whether the Wuhan Institute continued on the work of the proposal that wasn't funded by DARPA. And there remains the unedifying spectacle of institutions and senior scientists scrambling to control the narrative in ways that would have the least repercussions on them. That may turn out to be the sideshow of COVID, not the main act. I'd even say that's quite likely, although not proven. But surely it's time to really blow the lid on this, unredact the emails, get the various main characters testifying to Congress. Do we not deserve to get this properly and finally nailed down and investigated now? I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest yes. Now, I've rather skipped over in all of this the detailed back and forth of the scientists' emails as COVID-19 was first emerging, and the evidence that they considered highly possible, the thing that they then tried to squash in public. I went into the detail of all of those emails where this had been revealed in this video here. If you've reached this point, you might want to watch that one next.